Okay, so let us begin then with our learning material, and we're starting with authenticating hadith. And by the way, we should say that we're going to try to make the lectures pretty short, kind of bite-sized morsels rather than hour-long lectures. That way you can listen to a 10 or 15-minute lecture here, next one, when you have some free time, etc. We think that courses work better that way. And if you've watched Khan Academy or other courses, that's what a lot of people are going to rather than long hour and a half lectures. So why authenticate hadith? If somebody says the Prophet said so and so, why don't we just listen to that? Well, there are a lot of reasons actually. If you've ever played the game Telephone, you already know the most important one. And I actually didn't believe that things happen this way in Telephone until I played the game a few times myself, and it's crazy. In this game, a circle of people sit down, and the first person whispers a message to the second, who then whispers it to the third, and so on. Invariably, by the time we get to the last person, the message is often very different from what the first person whispered. So, the idea is that even with the best of intentions, messages often change when they are relayed from person to person because small mistakes, changes, additions, etc. gradually creep in. Now, there were no tape recorders, video cameras, computer documents, no reliable ways to store written materials at the time of the Prophet, who lived in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. As a quiz question, do you know when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was born and when he died? He was born roughly in the year 570 and died roughly in the year 632. So, his teachings were transmitted person to person for a few generations until some scholars began to write down and record the Prophet's hadiths to preserve them for future generations so they wouldn't change or be lost. So you may have heard of such collections as Sahih al-Bukhari, written by the great scholar Imam al-Bukhari, and it was these scholars who did the great work of trying to authenticate the Prophet's hadiths. And in the following sections, we're going to become familiar with how they did that and learn some of the key terminology used by them to classify hadiths according to their soundness. In other words, how authentic we believe them to be. Before we get there, though, there are a couple of other points that need to be mentioned and understood as to why it was important to our early scholars to authenticate hadiths. The first is that although the general art of writing existed in Arabia at the time of the Prophet, I mean, people knew there was such a thing as writing, it wasn't common, and paper didn't exist. Things were written down on materials like parchment or animal skins. This, for example, is how the Quranic verses were written down as they were revealed to the Prophet, who would then have his scribes write down the newly revealed verses. Now, under these circumstances, it may come as a surprise to you to learn that the Prophet actually asked his companions to not write down his sayings, but only to write down the Quran. So we always talk about how important the Sunnah is, but the Prophet actually said, don't write down my hadiths. And this was to avoid any possibility of confusion between the Prophet's hadiths, which were his own human words, and the revealed Quran, which is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it is reported that the Prophet said, do not write anything from me except the Quran, and whoever has written anything from me other than the Quran should erase it. Narrate from me without hesitation, but whoever falsely attributes something to me, let him await his seat in hellfire. And this hadith is according to Abu Sa'id al-Khudri and is recorded in Sahih Muslim. So, the practice, at least in the early history of Islam, is that in general, the Prophet's hadiths were not written down, but were preserved orally by people remembering them and telling them to each other. And so you can see the analogy between this and the game telephone. And the challenge then that our early scholars, when they actually got to writing them down, had in trying to authenticate the hadiths, make sure they were real, make sure there weren't mistakes, and so forth. Now, remembering the hadiths and teaching them to each other may not have been a problem in the time of the companions of the Prophet. They, by the way, are known in Arabic as the Sahaba, and we will use this term a lot. Or even in the first generation after the death of the Prophet and his companions, and that generation is known as the successors, or in Arabic, the tabi'un, those who followed or came after, i.e. they followed and came after the companions and the Prophet himself. But as more and more generations began to pass, scholars began to worry that this telephone game phenomena would set in, and so began collecting hadiths and writing them down. Now, interestingly, Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second Khalifa, who reigned from the years 13 to 24 Hijri, and by the way, we will use the Hijri dates and the Gregorian calendar dates sort of interchangeably so that we become familiar with both. So Umar ibn al-Khattab reigned from 13 to 24 Hijri. So the year 13 after the Hijrah of the Prophet, when the Islamic calendar begins, to the year 24. He proposed to collect the hadith together and preserve the sayings of the Prophet, and he gave this matter very serious consideration, but then he abandoned the project for fear that the Muslims would neglect the Quran and occupy themselves studying the written hadiths. So the project of collecting and writing the hadiths had to wait about a century after the death of the Prophet to be even initiated, and this was during the reign of the Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz in about the year 99 Hijri, so about a century after the Hijrah of the Prophet. This Caliph, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, requested from several of the great scholars of that time who had devoted themselves to learning the traditions of the Prophet to begin actually collecting these traditions, these hadiths, and among these were scholars like Abu Bakr ibn Muhammad ibn Hazm and Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. And by the way, you don't have to worry about all of these different names. Everything that I say, almost everything, will be in the written syllabus that comes with this course. And so when they began then to collect the hadiths, they relied on people's memories, on the things that had been passed down for a few generations, but they were also aided in this by some existing written records of some hadiths. Now, if you've been listening, you may ask, how? Didn't the Prophet forbid writing down his sayings? Well, yes, but that prohibition was for the general public, but it seems that the Prophet actually gave a limited permission to some of the closest companions to preserve his sayings in writing, people that he trusted very closely. Thus, several companions actually did end up writing some of the Prophet's hadiths, and among those who were reported to have had some written collections of the Prophet's hadiths that they passed down to their students from the time of the Prophet were companions. And remember, companions are those who lived at the time of the Prophet, who saw the Prophet, and we'll define it more precisely later. But companions like Jabir ibn Abdullah, Abu Huraira, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and Sa'd ibn Ubadah, all of these people had their own written collections where they preserved some hadiths, and those were known as sahifas, or pages. Also, some scholars think that once Islam became more established and people knew the Quran, the Prophet then gave a broader permission for the writing of his hadiths, since he was no longer worried that it would be confused with the Quran. So, when the first generation of scholars who actually began systematically collecting hadiths set to their work, they had two sources. They had hadiths that were passed down orally from person to person, from teacher to student for the first century or century and a half. And they had these various collections that were actually written down, known as the Sahifas, that were also passed from teacher to student, and they used both of these sources in their work. So we see that the Hadith scholars had their job cut out for them. But there was actually another big issue besides possible mistakes creeping in over time that made it very necessary for scholars to exert the effort that they did to authenticate Hadith. And this problem may surprise you, but it's the problem of Hadith fabrication. What does that mean? It means people just making up Hadiths, saying knowingly that the Prophet said this or that when they know that that is false. Now, given the importance of the Prophet's example and the prestige to knowing and teaching his example, as well as the early rise of political tensions in the young Muslim Ummah, we can begin to piece together the different motivations for people to knowingly fabricate hadiths for their own ends. The important thing for us, though, to begin with, is to be clear that this happened, and it happened on a broad scale. And so here's a quote from a name that we will be hearing a lot about in this course, or really quoting from his work a lot in this course, Professor Muhammad Kamali, from his book Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence. And he says, quote, "There is no dispute about the occurrence of extensive forgery in the hadith literature. The ulama of hadith are unanimous about this." Now, the exact beginnings of forgery are difficult to ascertain, but it probably actually began in the lifetime of the Prophet himself or very soon thereafter. Therefore, even during the lifetime of the Prophet, the companions themselves became concerned to ensure the validity of sayings attributed to him. And so, when the companion Abu Musa al-Ash'ari told Umar ibn al-Khattab that the Prophet said that if you knocked on someone's door 3 times and they didn't answer, you should leave, Umar demanded that Abu Musa find a second person to corroborate that the Prophet had actually said this. Now, the fabrications began to really escalate during the war of apostasy, the so-called Hurub al-Ridda, during the rule of Abu Bakr, and then began to become a very serious issue at the time of the great fitna or civil strife between the 4th Caliph, Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin, and Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, starting at about the year 40 Hijri. So, the scholars, when they began studying hadiths, they found that there were several different motives for forging hadiths, and multiple scholars have written extensive works on the forged hadith. And the various motives and categories of fabrication are important to those interested in the proper use of hadith, and they actually help us navigate some of the issues that we will encounter in Module 2 about applying hadiths. Now, the motives for forgery have been classified into, let's say, 4 main types. Number 1, there was forgery by the heretics, or what is known in Arabic as az-zanadiqa, and this was a diverse group of people who turned against Islam, and they attempted to discredit Islam and the Prophet by fabricating hadiths which distorted the creed of Islam. This group also included the hypocrites who pretended to be Muslim but worked to distort the image of Islam. So, for example, the scholars know that a man named Abdul Karim ibn Abi al-Awja' confessed to fabricating 4,000 hadiths where he had distorted the haram, the prohibited, and the halal. Another category, which was politically motivated rather than religiously motivated as people against Islam, these were Muslims who were fighting a sectarian battle. And so the second motivation is sectarian hadiths. These hadiths were fabricated for political motives. We talked about the great struggle between Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu and his supporters, and between Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. And so, for example, the supporters of Ali fabricated a hadith where they said that the Prophet said, "When you see Muawiyah on my pulpit, kill him." On the other hand, the supporters of Muawiyah fabricated the hadith where the Prophet said, "The trusted ones are three, I," meaning Prophet Muhammad, Gabriel, and Muawiyah. And this practice was unfortunately quite extensive. And rigorous hadith scholarship has shown numerous examples, and a few of those are detailed in the syllabus, not really detailed, mentioned in the syllabus. So for example, a man named Awana ibn al-Hakam, he belonged to the Umayyad party, supporting the Umayyads, among them Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan and his descendants. They concocted traditions in favor of the Umayyads. A man named Abu Ayna, on the other hand, forged hadiths to support the party of Ali ibn Abi Talib. There was a general named Al-Muhallab, his name is Al-Muhallab ibn Abi Safra, and he fought against the Khawarij. We'll be hearing a little bit about them later. And he confessed that he had forged hadiths against them. A man named Al-Talqani, who was a member of the Murji'ite sect, forged hadiths to support his sect's doctrines. And for example, a man named Ghiyath ibn Ibrahim from the court of the Caliph al-Mahdi made intentional alterations to the hadith to please the Caliph. And so the reason we're mentioning these examples is to make sure that we all understand how extensive this practice actually was. And according to the scholar Muhammad Siddiqui, in his book Hadith Literature, Its Origin, Development, and Special Features, because this sort of fabrication was so widespread, and I'm quoting directly from him now, most of the traditions which extol the virtues of certain individuals, tribes, provinces, districts, towns, or a sectarian leader owe their origin to some of these deliberate forgers and have been identified by the hadith scholars as mere inventions. Another interesting category of hadith forgers were the storytellers. Now, these are individuals who found that their prestige was greatly enhanced by claiming that they had knowledge of some hadith, and would often take to telling stories in the mosques after prayers. So Professor Siddiqui states that, quote, "They invented thousands of such amusing anecdotes as might appeal to the masses, attributed them to the Prophet, and related them publicly." And a particularly amusing story in this vein is of such a man who related to his audience after prayer a hadith on the authority of the great scholars Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Yahya ibn Ma'in. And this hadith was that when a man says, "La ilaha illallah," there is no God but God, God creates from each letter a bird with a beak of gold and feathers of pearl. Now, unfortunately for the storyteller, both Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Yahya ibn Ma'in happened to be in the audience and confronted him with the fact that they had related no such hadith. The fourth category is the most puzzling of all, and perhaps the most tragic of all. It is the pious misguided. This is a group of people of knowledge and piety who began to fabricate hadiths for the service of Islam, so to speak. So, for example, a man named Nuh ibn Abi Maryam, who studied with well-known theologians and developed a reputation for great learning, started fabricating hadiths on the virtues of the Quran. And when confronted that these were forged, he admitted that he had forged them in order to entice people toward the Quran. There are numerous other tragic examples in the hadith literature. For example, a man named Abban ibn Abi Ayyash, who had a reputation as one of the most pious people of his day, narrated 1,500 hadiths on the authority of the companion Anas ibn Malik that turned out to have no foundation. Now, as a side note, because Anas ibn Malik, who was a young boy when the Prophet, peace be upon him, died, he was the last major surviving companion. A lot of the forged hadiths of the later generations are attributed to him. The syllabus goes through several other examples just for your interest. And one of them that I want to mention, because it will relate to how scholars authenticate hadiths, is the case of a man named Abu Isma. His full name is Abu Isma Nuh ibn Abi Maryam. And this man narrated hadiths from Ikrimah, who was a student of the companion Ibn Abbas. And these hadiths were about the merits and virtues of reading certain surahs or verses of the Quran. And when he was confronted by the fact that none of Ikrimah's other students narrated these hadiths, he admitted that he had forged them because he saw people drifting away from the Quran and wanted to steer them back toward it. And perhaps the most tragic of all, or most disturbing of all, is that according to Professor Muhammad Siddiqui, the followers of a religious leader known as Al-Sijistani argued that it was permissible to forge hadiths in order to enjoin what is good and forbid what is evil. What do you think of that? I myself find these stories absolutely amazing in a tragic way, in an unbelievable way, given that one of the strongest hadiths recorded by the scholars of hadith passed through numerous chains of transmission and narration involving multiple companions, is the Prophet saying, "Whoever intentionally ascribes to me what I have not said, then surely let him await or occupy his seat in hellfire." I've put up two Arabic renditions of the hadith through two different chains of transmission, and we will talk more about this issue of chains of transmission as the course progresses. But the hadith says, "Man kadhaba alayya muta'ammidan falyatabawwa maq'adahu min an-nar," which is exactly the translation we gave above. And this hadith is a mutawatir hadith. And again, that's one of the terms that we will be talking about, inshallah, extensively as the course progresses. But this is probably the only hadith known to have been related by more than 70 different companions. And it is, to me, absolutely unbelievable that in the face of this hadith, some genuine, sincere Muslims thought it was acceptable to fabricate hadiths that tried to motivate people to do good, thinking that they were somehow helping the cause of the Prophet. In fact, you notice for those who speak Arabic, the hadith says, "Man kadhaba alayya muta'ammidan," whoever lies against me on purpose. And when one of the fabricators of hadith was confronted with the above hadith, he said that "La akdhibu alayhi ana akdhibu lahu," that I am not lying against him, I am lying for him. So it's interesting to note that then while the early scholars were authenticating hadiths, and then they discovered this process of hadith fabrication, that alongside with cataloging the true authentic hadiths in some works, great works like Sahih al-Bukhari, some of them also wrote collections of the fabricated and false hadiths so that Muslims would be wary of them. These hadiths are called things like al-mawdu'at, the forged hadiths. Among the best known of these works is by the scholar al-Shawkani, and that work is called al-Fawaid al-Majmu'a fil Ahadith al-Mawdu'a, the collected beneficial knowledge about fabricated hadiths. and a book called Al-Mawdu'at al-Kubra, The Great Fabrications, by a scholar named Ibn al-Jawzi. And as we said, these fabricated hadiths are called either munkar, rejected, or mawdu', which literally means inserted or placed. In other words, falsely inserted into the hadith literature. And whichever term we use, munkar or mawdu', it basically means that these hadiths are forged and rejected. And we'll talk a bit more about these later, but for now, as we progress forward, let's concern ourselves with the more authentic hadiths, with the hope that you're now convinced that there was a genuine need for the scholars to try to separate true from false hadiths. And in our next lecture, we will begin talking about how they did that. Assalamu alaikum, and see you next time, inshallah.